All right. Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where in the world you're tuning in from. Welcome to the November edition of Shaping EDU Live. Yes, that's right. I can't believe that we're already in November. For those of us in the US, we're getting closer and closer to the Thanksgiving holiday. Very exciting. Hopefully you are all here and ready for an engaging program all about fostering active learning in digital realms. Joining me today is a vibrant lineup of panelists, and we'll be able to introduce everyone in just a moment here. But first things first, I'd love to welcome everyone and get you a little bit acquainted with today's programming in the room. First things first, we really like to encourage audience members when they come in to turn on their camera. That's so we can see everyone in the room, and this can be as conversational as possible, of course. But if you are not speaking, and even if you are a panelist and not speaking, I encourage you to keep yourself on mute. And that's so that we can avoid kind of any stray noises that may pop up from colleagues or cats or bells ringing or anything along those lines happening in the background. So thank you so much for keeping yourselves on mute. That said, just to orient you a little bit to the Zoom room, there is a chat, and you are welcome to pose any questions, comments, introduce yourself, share stories and examples in that chat. It is collectively ours to use throughout the entire program. For those of you who may be big into social media like myself, we have a hashtag, and that is hashtag #ShapingEDU. I just want to give a little bit of love to Penn State for our partnership. So the Shaping EDU Live partnership is between ASU and Penn State from Penn State's Co-Action Learning Lab. And if this is your first time showing up to one of these events, these are generally 1 to 2 hour events, although today it's a 90-minute event, so right there in the middle, hosted in Zoom. And essentially we have our panelists as subject matter experts on a very specific issue who are going to be sharing their definitions and their stories. And then as they're talking, hopefully you're going to be reflecting on your own perspectives, because we're going to be inviting you, after this is all over, to collaborate on a draft resource that we're going to end up publishing under a Creative Commons license to help advance active learning in digital realms. So thank you ASU and thank you Penn State for making this all possible. But enough from me. Before we dive into this really important topic of active learning and what it means in increasingly digital worlds, we have a whole bevy of panelists here to address a lot of questions we have planned, and who have been working really hard together on actually a draft resource model to help advance active learning. So I'd like to ask each of them on the call to introduce themselves, and I'll start. I'm Samantha Becker. I am the Executive Director for Creative and Communications for the University Technology Office at ASU. In my role, I touch a number of initiatives, but we're always focused on how technology could have more of a human impact and what the impact is there, and how we can include stakeholder voice around technology decisions. Joining me today are a great group of panelists. And so first things first, I'm going to kick it over to you, Rick, to introduce yourself.
Hi, everybody. I'm Rick Beal. I'm an instructor in industrial engineering at the University of Central Florida. Within my department, I'm known as the online guy. I guess every school has one. So I'm very interested in active learning, and particularly in the role of the digital realm. 11 of the 12 classes I teach are exclusively online. So active learning to me is recognizing the fact that we can't really teach students. We can only create and enable the environment in which they can learn. So the more that they can actively engage in that environment, the more successful we are. And that's really why I'm here. So hello, everybody.
Thank you so much, Rick. We really appreciate you being here. And if you haven't already guessed, audience, yes, we're going in alpha order of last name. You're up next, Julie.
Hi guys, my name is Julie Kaufman. I am a student at the University of Missouri. I work in the Educational Technologies Department. I provide
Julie, you're breaking up just a bit, so I'll ask you to shut off your video, so hopefully that will help with the bandwidth so we could hear your perspectives. Do you mind just, I know we know you're a student from University of Missouri. Do you mind just repeating a little bit of where you're coming from?
Yeah, absolutely. So I work in the educational technologies department where I provide support for Zoom, for Clear, and and courses.
Thank you so much, Julie. I'm going to go ahead and ask you to dial in. Unfortunately, the audio is breaking up significantly, and we'd love to be able to hear your voice. So I'll just ask you for the next portion to dial in. Thank you so much. We're so happy you're here with us. Wendy, over to you.
Hi, everybody. Wendy Howard from University of Central Florida. I'm the director of our Pegasus Innovation Lab for Digital Learning, and we have a renewed emphasis on active learning currently through one of the major initiatives that we're leading, which is a course redesign initiative. So we are working with 100 faculty to redesign their courses for online or blended modalities, and we have a specific emphasis on adaptive and active learning in these redesigns. So it's a major 3-year initiative and a big part of our world right now.
Major initiative, no doubt. Thanks so much for joining us, Wendy. Nicole, you're up next.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nicole Stahl. I work with Wendy at the Pegasus Innovation Lab at the University of Central Florida. With my job, I help with scheduling. I do a lot of the tracking with these different initiatives that we keep track of, especially like with the redesign initiative that Wendy mentioned. I'm also a student at UCF getting my master's degree in instructional design and technology. So I have personal experience as a student with active learning.
We love getting the student perspective, both in the graduate and undergraduate perspective. So we're so happy, Nicole, that you're joining us. And of course, Julie as well. Thank you so much for being here. And of course, serving in your dual role. Masha, over to you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Masha Krasmanovic. I'm joining you from the University of Central Florida as well. There are several reasons why I'm personally connected to the topic of active learning in digital realms. I work as a postdoctoral scholar at the Faculty Center for Teaching and Learning, so a lot of our programming for faculty and graduate teaching assistant has actually been focused on active learning. This is what they really, really want to learn about. I also do a lot of research in the scholarship of teaching and learning. Again, most of which is about active learning. And I'm also an adjunct faculty in the College of Education, actually College of Community Innovation and Education. I teach graduate classes in higher education program. So these are mixed mode classes. So I'm really hoping to benefit from this discussion myself and make my classes more engaging for my students. Thank you.
Thank you, Masha. We're so happy that you're here with us today. Hi, Bethany. How's it going?
Going all right. Thank you. I'm Bethany Stone. I'm a teaching professor in biology and also a faculty fellow in our Teaching for Learning Center here at the University of Missouri in Columbia. And I was first introduced to the concept of active learning. I was very fortunate in graduate school back in the, well, I won't say when, a while ago, when I took a course from Dr. Sandy Abel, and she is one of the leaders in college education, especially in the sciences. And she introduced us to active learning. So before most people even knew about the word, she was already instructing us in how important it was and how we could go about doing it in multiple formats in our classrooms, be it face-to-face or online. And so that's been one of my goals my whole career, is to find better ways to make my students, or help my students, construct their own learning.
I love that. And that fits in really nicely. I feel like this is a great segue from our previous Shaping EDU Live event, which was on student-led learning. And shameless plug, that session, as well as all past Shaping EDU Live sessions, are available on the Shaping EDU website at ASU, as well as our YouTube channel. Thank you so much, Bethany. So glad you're here. Dana, over to you.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Dana Wren from Course Design and Technology at the University of Missouri. So I'm lucky enough to get to work with Bethany and Julie. We help faculty members teach well with technology. And so a lot of times that does include putting a lot more active learning in their courses. I also am an adjunct faculty member in the College of Education here and teach a class on learner-centered curriculum design. So I have a lot of interest in this topic from a variety of angles.
And we're looking forward to uncovering every single one of those angles in the next hour and a half. Thank you so much, Dana. Francisca, last but not least.
Hi, everybody. This is Francisca Yonakuda from the University of Central Florida as well. I am an instructional technologist by background, but in my daily life, I oversee our web development and data science engineering here at the University of Central Florida for our online learning efforts. And so why is active learning so important to me is that from someone who needs to be in the background, I like to know what the Riks, the Mashes, and the Bethany's of the world, the faculty, need in terms of technology to be able to facilitate active learning. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you all so much for being here. This is one of those topics that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Just by show of hands, how many of you have ever attended a higher education, K-12, or some other educational conference, and there's been a format where you've maybe had to sit in groups and do a discussion? And how many of you have ever faced this scenario? You get there, you start to have a discussion, and then you realize no one could actually agree on the definition of the thing being discussed. Maybe it's personalized learning, active learning. These types of topics and terms all have sort of different definitions floating out there and mean different things to different people. And so before we even delve into how to cultivate more active learning experiences, I think it's really important that we bring all of our perspectives together and get a sense from everyone what active learning means, what lens they're viewing it through. And I don't want to limit this to just the panelists either. So at this point, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to just define active learning so that we can kind of same page around that. And at the same time, audience, using the handy dandy chat, I'm going to ask you to chime in with your own definitions of active learning. And what's going to happen is we're going to make, while the panelists are introducing their definitions, we're going to make a word cloud of all the audience definitions and share it with you afterwards. But before we start defining, I want to just give a little bit of a teaser. Oftentimes when we are working on some sort of publication or framework, oftentimes that's where we end. We say, okay, thanks for all these discussions and all this research. Now let's build some sort of framework or some sort of model. We're doing things a little bit flipped here today in the interest of active learning. All of us panelists have been meeting now for, weeks, months, talking about active learning and wanting to make sure that we can not only have a very, very vibrant discussion here today, but leave all of you and all of your colleagues in the whole field with something an artifact from this conversation to actually help advance active learning. So I want to thank Rick on the call so much for taking the lead on this, and Lara for her amazing design skills. But what we have now is a draft model. D for do, R for ramp up, A apply, F flip, and 5 transform. We are looking at this as a potential maturity model. So there's sort of different stages in maturity and sophistication of an active learning experience in a digital realm. How can you begin to see yourself in those different stages? So this is not the end resource. This is just the beginning. And as we're talking about our active learning definitions, as we're talking about our stories, as we're talking about examples and research, I just want you to kind of keep this model back of mind. It's okay if you forget it. We tried to make it easier by having it stand for draft. Because at the end of the session, at the end of these conversations, we're actually going to invite you to build on this model, to tell us what we missed, what we should be adding, why R should be a P and stand for something completely different. Those are the types of opinions and feedback we're hoping for. So this is just V1. And with your help after this session, by virtue of giving you access to a Google Doc version, we're really hoping for your edits for the next version, which we will then publish with everyone listed as contributors, including all of you that wishes to contribute under a Creative Commons license. So I just want to tease what we're working up to before we start, the really, really important foundational discussions of definition. So audience members, be thinking of your own personal definitions of active learning. I see the wheels turning already. be putting those into the chat. And I'm going to kick things over to each of you to provide a little bit of a definition. So we'll reverse things just a bit, and I'll start with you, Francisca. What is your definition of active learning?
Okay, so throughout our conversations preparing for this webinar, I am still conflicted, but in a nutshell, what I am comfortable at the moment defining active learning as is, it is when we as learners, faculty, students, ourselves, are deeply engaged in the learning. But I see two components to it. One that is for the individual, the reflective learner in the process of whatever the learning objectives is, and a component that's more social. And that's why I so love Paul Signorelli's definition of co-conspirators. And it's sort of like it's not one or the other. We are all deeply engaged in a personal level and as a community in achieving. I think that's the only way we can kind of evolve, if you will, as humans, as human beings, and being learners in life.
Well said. Thank you, Francisca. Bethany, what's your sense of active learning?
Sure. So for me, active learning is when you provide some structure for those students to construct their own learning, and they might do that through, questioning, creating, or any other skills, practicing with any of those other skills that you want them to develop. I think that important aspects of active learning is that you help the students develop a growth mindset where they're not afraid of learning from their mistakes, and also that community is a part of it. I've seen that come up in the chat, that there's a willingness to work together on the different aspects of the tasks you put in front of them.
Well said. Thank you, Bethany. What about you, Dana?
Well, I think we talk about it with faculty members a lot in terms of making sure that you're providing lots of different types of engaging assignments. Like Bethany said, just making sure that you're giving them different ways to engage with the content and how to scaffold that really over a course and provide multiple opportunities for them to fail early and then have some successes with it later. Because I think that engagement is really about creating their own learning and having a very authentic experience. So both in the assignments and the assessments. So I always think a lot about curricular alignment and just making sure we're really providing those opportunities for students that we think we are. So I think it's important.
Thank you so much, Dana. Masha, I'll ask the same question to you. What's your definition?
Well, it's a very tough question. I'm going to start with that because when I think about overarching definition of active learning, I want to make one or use one that would embrace all of my learners, which at the moment are first semester, not even freshmen, but first semester students and doctoral students. So there is a little bit of a gap there, and both students in face-to-face classes, mixed method online classes, and not to mention all other types of diversity among our students. So for me, it's really any type of instruction that is student-centered, that really focuses on the student first. And the ultimate goal that I try to accomplish through active learning is student engagement, but not just for the sake of being engaged, because I don't believe that every engagement is active learning. I think it's a student engagement that in turn increases student interest in and their responsibility for learning.
Thank you so much, Masha, for sharing that. And this is really challenging. I mean, I know these panelists are making it easy with their well-articulated definitions, but this really is tricky because it means so many different things to so many different people, and sometimes we attach ourselves over time to those definitions. Let's hear from one of our students. Nicole, what does active learning mean to you?
So I tend to fall back on the idea of active being the next step from passive learning, where the student is just receiving information and the student is then more engaged. We use that word a lot from like the chat and from what else everyone else has been saying, where the student is then doing something. They're moving, they're thinking, they're collaborating. It's more like those ing verbs. Instead of just receiving information, they're doing something, they're being active. I can't think of any other word except to engage. It's the student actually applying and showing the mastery of the skills that they've been learning throughout the course or the material or whatever information they've received.
Well, I think it's no accident that you've used the word engage, because that is an active verb, and engage covers a lot of territory. Engaging are they up? Are they discussing? Are they interviewing someone? And so it can mean so many different things. But it is, I think that when we start moving towards active verbs, that's always a good sign. Thank you so much, Nicole. Over to you, Wendy.
There we go. Sorry, I was muted. So I think with something that's so fuzzy and nuanced, I keep coming back to what is not active learning is something we can probably agree upon a little bit more easily. So I love what Jenna said. I immediately went to, it's not just consuming, it's not passive, it's not listening to lectures. And I think if we start at that point, we can agree with that. And then I love all the various nuances that my fellow panelists have already articulated. So if I were to take a step back and just say, can we simplify it, bare bones, what can we agree upon? I'm hearing over and over again what my initial reaction was, is really just engaging students through interactive learning with the material. Anything other than passive, I think we can all agree upon.
Thank you. I really appreciate your model of, well, let's make sure we know what it's not, because that's equally important. Julie, just want to check and see if you've been able to join us via phone.
Hello, yes, can you hear me?
Yes, sounding beautiful.
Awesome, sorry about that. I haven't had that problem before.
Technology, it happens. We're so happy you're with us.
So I define active learning by critically and continuously thinking about the material, not thinking about like what I'm going to have for dinner tomorrow or tonight, or what I'm going to do after class. I think a lot of it is also building on top of what you already know and just asking questions.
Yes, sometimes we need questions more than we need answers wrapped up in a bow. Thank you for raising that, Julie. Really appreciate that. And last but certainly not least, Rick, we'd love to hear your perspective.
I'm not sure I have one. I kind of go with Wendy. I don't know what active learning is, but I know it when I see it. I had a philosophy class once where we had to define the word fun. We were completely unable to do it because everybody tends to list things that are fun when they talk about fun, but they don't know how to actually define fun. I think active learning falls in the same category. I know characteristics I can look at and know that it might be happening, but I don't define those things as active learning. So when I've got an active classroom where I'm able to sit in the front of the room and sit back and watch them talk to each other and do things, there's probably active learning going on. But the fact that they're talking isn't the learning itself. So that engagement and activity, that ability to watch students reflect on the material, to think more deeply about it, to get their hands around it, sometimes figuratively, sometimes literally. Active learning is happening when I see those things. They aren't active learning, but when I see those things happening, I suspect that active learning is happening, that they're fully engaged in the material and really thinking about it in a high order way.
Active learning, we'll know it when we see it. I love it. Let's get those printed on some bumper stickers. Stat. Thank you so much. I'm just going to check in with you, Lara, and see, and this could be something that we share later in the program. No pressure. Were we able to get any audience feedback in a word cloud of any sorts?
Yes, indeed. So I can share my screen for a minute if that works.
Yeah, I'm going to stop my sharing. Okay. Let's see what we created.
So here is the word cloud. Let's see. Here we go. Here's the word cloud that we created with a participant and some key thoughts from panelists as well. I think it's really telling that learning is the most important thing here, followed shortly by students. And a whole bunch of other awesome ideas as well.
I love that floor is on there. I can only imagine what that came from. And I see co-conspirators made the cut.
Yeah, I might actually suggest that you take the word learning out of the tree That's more the heading. And it's creating noise. I'd like to see some of those other words a little larger, and I think they would be if you took the word learning out.
Interesting.
That is a good point.
Okay.
What happens? We're live. Anything can happen. We're making those changes.
Okay, let's see.
Students at the center.
So students at the center. Excellent.
That makes complete sense. So thank you all, audience and participants and panelists, for your input towards kind of generating some sort of collective definition, or at least a composite definition. What we'll do is we'll make sure to tweet out this word cloud after this event, and also share it in our Slack workspace as well. So thank you for just proving that I think that we have a lot of conversations to work around, where we're kind of seeing different perspectives of what adds up or could culminate to active learning, to even get us to a point of where we know it when we see it. So we've kind of set the stage now for active learning. I'm going to share my screen again, get back in this. We just have a few more slides to get to. Just quick show of hands. Are you seeing my slides? Okay, perfect. Okay. So we've talked about active learning. We've defined it, which is really important. But one thing that we haven't gotten to yet is, what are maybe some key ideas from the active learning literature? So what are other people aside from ourselves saying? So Masha, I'm going to pass this over to you.
Thank you. So we added this slide with the idea that implementing active learning may require all of us to shift from our traditional teaching approaches, such as lecture in a face-to-face class or a discussion board in an online class. So, and I say shift, I don't say abandon, but really will require us to think from multiple perspectives when it comes to our pedagogy. So what I was really happy to learn myself as I was reading all these articles about active learning is that literature has provided us with a great scope of active learning definitions, which are not mutually exclusive. They actually complement each other. So just like everybody said, active learning is this, and this, right? Which gives us more opportunity for actually applying it. The overarching definition that seems to be most frequently reported in the literature is that active learning is any type of learning activity that promotes higher order thinking, that extends beyond the traditional lecture, and that improves student engagement, which is what all of us have said, and what many of you have noted in your chat comments as well. Research also shows that there are numerous benefits to active learning, and most benefits have been recorded in the domain of student performance, exams, tests, and similar. But what is really interesting to know is that not only does active learning improve this higher order cognition or thinking, such as analyzing, evaluating, creating, but it also improves lower order cognition, which is remembering, understanding, and applying, or just helping our students master the content knowledge, which we know they need to master in order to move up. And I also saw a lot of you mentioning Bloom's taxonomy and all these verbs in formulating your learning objectives, and then using active learning to help students move through this hierarchy. So that's great because it has been supported by the literature. However, there is one caution that we all need to be aware of. Research also says and shows consistently that students will have a negative bias toward active learning, which in turn can limit the effectiveness of this approach. Even though research shows that students learn more when active learning is involved as an instructional approach, their perception of learning is actually, they think that they are learning less than their peers who are taught by traditional teaching methods. So this is just something for all of us to keep in mind, that our students may need a little bit more of, explanation why we're doing this and why we're changing this, that it's actually for their own good. Thank you.
No, thank you, Masha. And I really appreciate you raising the important point of context. what I like to try and remember, even for these Shaping EDU live events, I have to remind myself, when you go and watch an episode of your favorite TV show, there's always a previously on 24 or whatever TV show you're watching. There is always that 30-second kind of reel that kind of sets the stage, pulls people back in to like where we are in the current time frame. And so I think a really, really good tip is just to think about kind of scaffolding from course to course or whatever it is. What types of context can you be providing your students so that they feel like they can kind of just start jumping in and don't have to do a whole lot of prep work? Thank you. And Rick, I see that you have your hand up right now, so I just want to see.
I was just coughing, sorry.
Oh yeah, no problem. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and lower your hand. It's a feature of Zoom. You could raise.
Oh, did I accidentally press a button too? I didn't even know I did that.
Oh, hey, no problem. Just saying hi. That's good too. Yep. We talked about active learning, and thank you so much, Masha, for bringing in sort of the outside and the research perspectives into this conversation. But another part of the title of this program is fostering active learning in the digital realm. So digital is one of those words that could often be overused, and it feels sometimes a little silly to have to even ask this, but I do think actually there's something to be said for kind of plugging away and making sure that we align around how we can approach and what is the digital realm. So what do we mean by digital realm? Help us out here, Wendy.
Yeah, sure. So I think just help set the context for this conversation. It is important to define what do we mean by digital realm. And when I thought about it and through our early discussions, I kept coming back to it's really anything that's technology mediated. And back in the day, we might have used the term computer mediated, but with the emergence of more mobile devices being used, I like to use the broader term technology mediated now. So when we talk about active learning, I think it often immediately conjures up an image of a group of students gathered around a table in a classroom doing something together. And there's so many other ways to do active learning using technology that I think this is a really important topic for us to address. The opposite end of that spectrum is when we started talking about digital realm, I immediately went to, well, we're talking about fully online students, right? So what are we doing in the LMS to facilitate that, that image of what we picture in the classroom? How can we have some kind of an equivalent experience through the learning management system completely online? And that is one part of what we're talking about here, but there's also that gray middle ground where we can use technology in the classroom, we can use technology out of the classroom, we can use technology in a synchronous manner or asynchronous. And so I think we want to keep that flexibility there to say really in any environment you can use technology to facilitate digital active learning. And a great example for this middle ground that I came up with is we've been working with a faculty member in our College of Engineering and Computer Science who developed a glass model, which he coined that phrase for group learning at significant scale. He teaches in a traditional lecture hall, usually 100 to 150 students, and while it's a blended or mixed mode course, he was really worried about how to engage the students in this lecture hall and make it active with such large scale. You can't do traditional methods. So he worked with actually Francisca's team to create a streamlined plugin through our LMS, which is Canvas, to allow students to do online group problem solving in the lecture hall. There's actually a whole paper on this, so I'm just going to give a brief overview of what it looks like. But if you're curious, I just put an article into the chat that you can read up on. But basically, through Canvas, he used an Etherpad LTI so that students can be randomly assigned to small groups. And even if they're sitting in a large lecture hall, they can be working on their computer with other students spread around the room on solving a problem. And Etherpad allows him to go back later and see each individual student's contribution to solving the problem. But up at the front of the room, he can monitor all those groups and jump in to provide interventions as needed. And then whichever group solves the problem first can come up and then share their solution with the rest of the class. So that's a great example of utilizing technology in a classroom situation to really facilitate active learning at a large scale when you can't do traditional methods.
Thank you so much, Wendy. And I think what was so great about that is you described a really really interesting hybrid approach, especially for those large lecture halls, and personalizing it a little bit, or at least making sure that students know that they're not alone and they have sort of these cohorts to turn to. But when we talk about digital realms, and especially as, I'm coming from ASU, we have a fantastic online program, and more institutions all over the world are getting pressure, not even pressure, but are understanding the importance and the value of ensuring that they're providing online, hybrid, or fully online experiences so that more people could access and participate in high quality learning experiences. So Bethany, I'd love to ask you, how do you incorporate active learning in a face-to-face session compared to a fully online session? Because it's very nuanced.
Sure, and I must admit, I started face-to-face, so that's where most of my experience was until about 10 years ago when I was asked to teach online. And like I said in my introduction, I was already sold on the importance of active learning, of getting students engaged in their own development. And so I wanted that to be a component in my online courses as well. And what I learned as I taught face-to-face and I taught online is that really very similar lessons apply to both, in both venues. We have, I think that for me, keeping the focus on the learning objectives and making that inform what type of activities I want my students to do, how I want them to engage with the material. I think that's an important goal in both face-to-face and online courses. Again, a focus on the students doing in both. And so it's very tempting. I know some professors will go into an online course thinking they're going to put up a bunch of videos and students are going to watch that. Well, that's very passive. As we defined, that's not active learning. And so finding things that you can do online or in your face-to-face that have the students doing. And I love the examples of the glass model where they're using technology to help with that face-to-face, but you can use that same technology on an online course. And then just making sure that the students get some scaffolding, that they get some support. I think maybe one misconception about active learning, be it face-to-face or online, is that, well, students need to know a bunch of stuff before they can be expected to do anything with it. Well, no, that's not necessarily true. They can acquire that knowledge while they're doing it. But you still need to provide some scaffolding. You do need to give them some instructions, some reasons why they're doing this, maybe share those learning objectives with them and say, okay, this is our objective. Now this is the activity we're going to do to help you develop the skill or this knowledge that I want you to be able to demonstrate by the end of the course. And then I think maybe another kind of lesson learned from active learning, be it face-to-face or online, is that all of that, even though the students are doing more, it does require a little bit more on our part as well in terms of, grading or scoring, or just kind of making sure people are being accountable for what they're producing. And there are some shortcuts we can take. There's some things that we can do to help make that easier, both face-to-face and online. One of the shortcuts that we use, I use in both my courses, for example, is to maybe I don't grade all of the questions or all the aspects of a product, but I might just grade one part of it. Maybe that most important, that most pivotal question of an activity. That might be the one that I grade, for example. So there is an increase in your work, but with some strategies you can reduce that and make it manageable. So that's kind of how I view both face-to-face and online, very similar in how I approach it. And I think that the experience for the students is very similar.
Thank you so much for sharing, especially your personal experiences, Bethany, and for noting that, yes, this does increase the workload when it comes to grading or scoring or assessing for educators. So I'm just kind of thinking out loud here. Are there other ways to think about active learning? So we talk so much about active learning, student-led learning. But what if we were to flip that and say active teaching? Is that a thing? So when you talk about the increased kind of load for educators, for faculty and grading and scoring, like, are there any other strategies that other panelists or anyone in the audience has for, as a faculty member, as an educator, or even those that work with faculty and educators, how to kind of transition if there is going to be that bigger workload, and kind of help curb that, or help make it manageable? Well, definitely something to be thinking about, because as we're gearing more towards active learning, certainly faculty, instructor support is going to be essential. So before we get into the next portion of our conversation here today, when we kind of get back to the maturity model that I teased to you on screen at the beginning of our meeting, I want to kind of pause here and check in with the audience and just see, based on the definitions you've heard, some of the stories and examples you've heard, what stories of active learning or tips would you like to share based on your own experiences? This is a time where you can raise your hand. You could unmute yourselves. I'd love to hear from you. And no worries, no pressure. Oh,
can you hear me? Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm calling from my car. I hope you guys can hear me. My name is Josh Calkins. I work at the School of Life Sciences at ASU. And one of our success stories is we have an evolution course, and the faculty had a very passive course with a lot of lecture. And then we moved to a model where the faculty started to adopt worksheets in class, where students were doing problem solving in class. And the students and it took them about a semester to kind of work out all the kinks, but now the students are really much more engaged and recognize the value of solving problems in class that are similar to problems that they see in exams. So I think that was a real tremendous success story for us in the School of Life Sciences.
Thank you so much for sharing, Josh. I know that ASU has our active adaptive model. That's particularly been very, very successful in the biospine and in many different areas. And so I'll paste a link to any ASU examples in the chat. And I know there's other ASU folks on this call. Represent, please be pasting in your examples and your experiences, and even just sharing them just like Josh did as well. Thank you. Anyone else care to share their examples? And when we're sharing examples, don't feel that they need to be exemplars, like they need to be so far along and have all kinds of evidence to support their success. We just want to hear from you what you're working on.
Samantha?
Yes.
Hi, this is Joan Brett at ASU. I want to share an example, but it's not about something working on, but it piggybacks the comment that someone made about students' reactions to active learning. And I remember a bazillion years ago when I was working on my undergrad at Ohio State, and I had some very active learning professors who were very engaged in it. And the reaction, especially to this one professor, who really, it was like driven by the students. And the reaction among the students is, he's not really doing any work. He's this brilliant man, and we never hear from him. We don't know, and he was like a leader in the field. And so it's interesting, it really resonated with the other speaker that talked about students. So as much as we engage in active learning, we really have to set the stage with our students about the why behind it, so we don't get that perception of, I'm doing all the work and what's the professor doing. And even in my evaluations with executive MBAs, we want to hear more from Joan and her experience. So I think it really is important to set the stage for what that means for students.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Joan. Really,
I think that is so important. I mean, I get, particularly like in my statistics class, I always get feedback from a few students who complain and basically say, the course was completely self-taught. I did all the work and learned all the material. I mean, they did in fact learn the stats, but sometimes they don't see what role I'm playing in that process. The majority don't seem to respond that way, but I always get a little bit of that feedback every semester from students who feel like I just wasn't there.
And there's a lot of good tips being shared right now in the chat area. So I would point you all back to those just to help with some of that perception.
Agreed. And I was just going to say, there's this huge perception among students that they're coming into a lecture, they want you to just open up their head, pour everything in, and they walk out again. And really, learning takes place when they're doing something. And I think the important thing is how you bookend some of these activities. It's all in the setup, you know, setting that expectation for why they're doing it, but then also at the end, debriefing and sharing what you as an expert in the field bring to that experience now that they have gone through this exercise of building knowledge. And thank you, Dana, because I was going to say the same thing. I put in the chat a link to the Teaching Online Pedagogical Repository that has a bunch of very specific examples for active learning and online.
Thank you so much, and I really appreciate the student perspective being brought up. And I'm gonna kick a question in a second here over to both or either one of our students. I'm recalling my experience in like the bridge from K through 12 to higher ed, right? Because a majority of us on the call are higher ed professionals, and I'm thinking about my own experience in high school even, and how you're kind of taught, whether expressly or you just kind of figure out how to quote unquote game the system as a student based on a very, very specific formula that's based on rote learning, taking tests, you know, writing papers, and really trying to understand exactly whatever it is the teacher, the educator wants, and then delivering that. And so essentially when we're talking about active learning, we're in many cases changing the script on students, and maybe from what their expectations are, from where they're coming from or learning as they know it. So providing not just context, but a unique value proposition to this model, and helping them understand how it will help them in their, not just in their learning, but in their life journeys as an important skill and habit, I think is really important to reinforce. I'd love your perspective around this, either Nicole or Julie or both, or our resident students here on the call.
I can go first. I know one thing that I've always struggled with as a student is definitely that struggle between the passive and active, where an instructor is trying to find techniques of what to do. I know one of the worst experiences I had in one of my classes was the instructor said, okay, read the textbook, come into class, ask me questions. There was no supplemental information, there was no guidance. It was, you do it on your own. So it was like an attempt to foster that active learning discussion in class, but it just didn't work that way. It needed a little bit more guidance. And then another thing that for a good experience was in one of my college classes where with discussions, I know it's hard because students, there's always that typical, I agree, and that's it. So my instructor had us, she assigned us 5 chapters to read. They were short chapters, thankfully, and each student in the group was assigned to a chapter of the textbook, and then you were required to either summarize it, pull in your own experience, make connections, and then from there, each student was able to respond, because since we had our own chapters that we were discussing, it gave us more opportunity to discuss different ideas, to share our own experiences, and it helped foster that discussion. So that felt more of an active environment online, because I know that's something really hard to do when you lose that face-to-face connection. I think you're muted, Sam.
I just broke my cardinal rule of unmuting myself before I speak. Yes, thank you so much for sharing that, Nicole, and really contrasting maybe a not so favorable experience you've had and a good one, just because it's important to start benchmarking and understand that just because something wasn't initially a good experience doesn't mean it doesn't have potential to grow from it. And I think a good way to set up this next segment is just to say there's different stages, there's different phases of active learning. And I think it's all about, you know, the institutional and departmental culture, but allowing ourselves to even take smaller steps, right? There's lower hanging fruit. Just because, you know, we're talking about active learning doesn't mean that there's this impetus for every single one of us to be these expert transformational rock stars, you know, in just a heartbeat. So there's sort of different phases that we can go through to understand how we can progress active learning in our courses and in our environments. So thank you so much. With that, I'm going to kick off one of our final segments of today's conversation, which is help us complete our draft maturity model for active learning. Based on our own conversations, this group of panelists has gotten together about 4 or 5 times over the past couple months. But now we're inviting actually you to review our draft and edit it so that whenever we publish something under a Creative Commons license, it reflects the viewpoint of a more diverse set of stakeholders from all different institutions across the world is our hope. So Rick, I'm going to kick it over to you to introduce our draft model.
Okay. Well, this kind of a model is called a capability maturity model. First, let me define that term for everybody. It's not a measure of outcomes. It's more a measure of what we do. It's the process and its inputs. So the presumption behind capability maturity modeling is that an organization with a higher level of capability is more likely to produce positive and favorable outcomes. So it isn't a direct measure of outcomes. It's a measure of the infrastructure you've put in place and the processes you put in place. How capable is the organization in doing what it intends to do? Also, you'll see here there are 5 hierarchical layers. It's a journey you take as you rise up in the layers. The choice of 5 is arbitrary, but not random. Its history goes back to the late 1970s when Philip Crosby published his book, Quality is Free, that really kicked off the quality movement in America. In it, he published a management maturity grid of management's maturity and capability for supporting quality. That grid had 5 levels. And of course, in American management, we love jumping on bandwagons, so 5 levels took off. Every capability model I've ever seen since then has had 5 levels. So had Philip Crosby done a 6-level model, we'd have 6 levels. So it's an arbitrary number, but it's not random. Most of these models in any industry you go to will have 5 levels to them. But the levels themselves are meant for most users, most of us, to be a view back in our history, but also an aspirational view toward our future. The objective here is to describe capability at the highest level, and everybody must achieve that, or everybody should already be achieving that, because almost nobody is. So let me just briefly go through them. The first level of maturity is really where we all start out. If I think back to my history when I started my first online courses, my first digital forays, and many of the courses we teach at UCF would be down at the do level of getting started. At UC, in our engineering college, we claim, brag if you will, that every one of our graduate courses is available digitally. Well, that's true if you don't mind the fact that you're watching the 3-hour recorded lecture from last night's live class. Yes, it's a digital offering, but it's, at best, we use the LMS to turn in assignments. You can email the instructor, and maybe you can watch the video over and over again, and that's an advantage. But you're still watching videos of a 3-hour live lecture class. And because it's offered digitally, you're watching a video of a class where the instructor is mostly speaking to an empty room because everyone's at home knowing they can watch it tomorrow at double speed. So to the extent that those are online classes, sure, but that's your lowest level of maturity. You can start to see some of those benefits. So most of us started out there, and some of us are still there. So a lot of our new faculty, a lot of my existing faculty in engineering are still operating at that level of the lowest capability maturity, and at least they've entered the digital realm, so they have gotten started. But at some point with practice and adding a little energy, you tend to move up to what we're calling the ramp-up stage of committing to learning and doing more than that. So really starting to move into the discussion realm, starting perhaps if you're recording videos to have them more topical. They're no longer the 3-hour live lecture. Maybe it's 5 or 6 chunks of 5 or 10-minute lectures from what would have been that kind of class. And the students are starting to become a little more responsible for what they're doing. So you start to get courses that couldn't be done the way they're being done in the live environment. They may not be using all the capabilities of the digital realm yet, but they've clearly crossed that boundary where they're trying to be more online than live in the technology setting. And as you move through that stage, you move up to the apply level where you want the digital realm to be your new normal. So you've got students doing things even in the online environment. They're going out and finding things. They're cooperating more with each other. A lot more learner-to-learner communication as they go through. My role as an instructor becomes more of coach in that environment than almost any other. But eventually you start to move past that to the flipped level. And flip's a good word there, as we've talked a lot as instructors about flipping our classes and getting them to be more active. So getting rid of the old assumptions and challenging the I am the font of knowledge kind of approach that I used even up to the apply level, I'm seeing more material created by my students. I'm seeing more peer review and interaction among my students, and really starting to get very, very active in that environment. So more and more learner-generated content that they're sharing amongst each other with presentations and projects and activities, things of that nature. More in engineering, we use more and more simulations at that level. And eventually moving up to the transform level, a true adaptive learning, active learning transformation of our environment. To say it's really now taking place in the students. You can't actually step back. You start to act as though you could step back and the class kind of runs itself and students are engaged and they're all working with each other. We know entropy kicks in. If we're not there to scaffold it and keep it moving, that would fade pretty quickly. But our presence is much less direct and visible as we go through. So it's this transformative model, and I like the cloud at the top of this model because really the sky's the limit on level 5. You're never done. You're just continuing to grow into your future as you go through. So there's some history here and some future here. If I look, I've been doing online education for quite a while now, and I'd say if I look at my portfolio of classes that I teach, and there's 11 online classes I actively teach. There's a total of 17, so 6 more that I teach less often. I would say my portfolio of classes is probably pretty representative of level 3. So I've been doing it a long time, and I'm not at level 4 or level 5 yet. I'm at level 3. I can honestly say most of my classes behave according to the criteria that I think we could define at level 3. I've left the do and the ramp-up stages behind. But for instance, I teach a class I was only assigned to do online less than a year ago. That class is mostly do and somewhat ramp up as I work on that material. It doesn't happen the first time you teach it. And even within my level 3 classes, I think I'm confident that I have some assignments here and there that probably would show up at a level 4 kind of capability, maybe push through to a level 5. But I don't have any complete courses yet that would occur at that level. In fact, most capability models are designed so that the majority of the people that are working seriously, they're doing a good job, they've been doing it for a while, are very likely to show up at level 3. 4 and 5 are almost always aspirational. As our education matures in the next 5 or 10 years, maybe 4 and 5 will become more normal and we'll have to invent even higher levels of maturity than that. But for now, this is kind of a snapshot of where we are in terms of our organizations. A lot of my faculty in the College of Engineering that I guide, they're just struggling to get from that getting started level 1 to the ramping up to level 2 and really using the kind of materials that are available in the environment. So that's just a snapshot of the model, if you will.
Thank you, and a great snapshot, and I'm going to hopefully help crystallize that snapshot and make it more concrete by asking panelists to give specific examples of active learning that they've either been a part of or witnessed or experienced somehow, and to start to kind of help categorize kind of where in this maturity model that would fall, so we could kind of see how this maturity model would actually work in practice. So Rick, I'll start with you because I know we have some slides that showcase some of your own examples.
Well, sure. This little piece here, I'd say, is important to get to the emerging level 2 stage, and it really is heavily dependent for level 3. At the stage 3, you've got students reading more, you've got them participating more, you've got them discussing more. One of the problems I run into in the digital environment is a lot of my classes run 200 people, 250 people, and we've got classes in engineering that run 400 and 500 people. So how do you do a good discussion group in a 250-person class, which is what this example is drawn from? So this is an actual screenshot from one of my classes on the people page in Canvas that I've annotated for you. So in order to get students working, it's hard to be the 200th person to post an original substantive thought in a discussion thread. So I don't expect them to do that. So I break all of my students up into discussion groups. So for any given discussion assignment, like my STAT class has 40 discussions in it over the course of the semester. Every discussion, every student discusses the same topic and has the same prompt and the same requirements, the same grading criteria. But I break up the students into discussion groups. And the way I name them, look, for instance, looking at the center there, discussion 3A there in the center, the number tells me when I name it, the ratio, how much of the class that I put in each group. So the 3A, B, C would be 1/3 of the class each. Okay, the 1/5, the 5A, 5B, 5C are roughly each 1/5 of the class. The reason I have more than one is in some weeks there might be 2 or 3 discussions where I want to break them into groups of 40 or 50 people. So I have to have groups set up so that they're not using the same group. So every week there's 3, 4, 5 discussions, and they're always doing the same discussions, but they're always in different groups. Some of the groups are larger than smaller. A 1/10 of the class can be as few as 20 people. I'll use that one for relatively easy discussions that I know a lot of people can contribute to easily. The 1/3 of the class, the large groups, I reserve those for the more difficult discussions, where if the groups were too small, you run the risk that you don't have someone randomly selected into that group who's going to jump in and participate in that discussion. So for tougher discussions, I use larger groups. Most of my discussions use the 5A, 5B, 5C, about a 1/5, about 40 people in a discussion group. Where even there, it's not easy to be the 40th person, but at least it's a possibility. And the people that don't know the answer, I always encourage them. If you're not sure what the answer is, then let other people post first. Let the rest of the class guide you to the correct answer. When you do feel you've learned enough and can jump in, go ahead and jump into the thread. And a 40, 50 person group works fairly well for that, which is why in a small class, a graduate class with 20 or 30 students, I don't bother to break them up into groups at all. But I find to get them really writing, because every one of my classes online, my goal is that every student by the end of the semester will have written 40,000 words. And about half of that falls into the discussion threads. About 40 discussions of 500 words each gives them about 20,000 words over the course of the semester. And we're pushing writing very heavily here at UCF. Here's another example that I use. This is from my analytics course. I would call this a level 4 flipped activity. It's one of the more advanced in terms of the maturity scale in my class. The class as a whole isn't. It looks like a pretty traditional statistics class across many of the assignments. But this is my students' favorite assignment. This is an actual screenshot from Canvas of the assignment that they receive, where they're doing a reading from our Ready text, chapter 3, about analyzing and processing in healthcare digital data, x-rays, CAT scans, MRIs, things of that nature. Very, very dry technical topics. The reading is about a 50-page chapter. Everybody used to read it in the old days. You get them to discuss a little bit of it, but it didn't come alive for them. This assignment is designed to bring it alive by taking them out to an activity. Sam, you can jump to that next slide. Taking them out to an activity where they can actually participate and practice citizen science. I didn't create this assignment. This activity webpage I take them to is actually published by the American Alzheimer's Association, and it represents real research. Jump to the next slide for me if you would. The activity they have to do, this is just a screenshot from it, is it's imaging data from Alzheimer's research where they've taken literally millions of hemostatic photographs of the human brain, studying whether blood blockage in capillaries and arteries is contributing to Alzheimer's spread. So they're challenged on this site as citizen scientists to look at individual blood vessels and determine whether or not that blood vessel is blocked. The red circle on this one indicates the one they're asking the student to look at now. This one is actually heavily blocked. You can almost not see the vessel at all. Up from center, in the center, you see an example of a blood vessel that's not blocked at all. So they're being asked on that slide on the bottom to slide the little dot across to indicate whether the one in the circle is either completely flowing or completely stalled. In this particular example, they drag it all the way over to almost completely stalled. And this is real research. The Alzheimer's research actually would take many, many, many years to have even grad students sit and curate all of this data. So instead, they've got literally thousands of people participating through this website to do this work for them. And the risk is low because literally hundreds of people will rate this very photograph. So even if I were to be mean and want to enter it as completely flowing, think I can really screw with the data, I actually can't statistically, because statistically I would be an outlier and they're going to throw me away anyway. So they don't use the data that citizens create until there's enough statistical agreement to know that yes, everybody rates this as a 9 out of 10, and that's what we're going to catalog this at. But literally you earn points. It's gamified, so my students earn points for doing this. There's even a list there on the left. None of these are my students, but people who are accumulating the top points in the game. So the assignment asks my students to go rate 10 photos and then write a reflective document on that. And I never have students stop at 10 photos. They always do 100, they do 200. I get notes from students a year later saying they're still doing it and they graduated already. So it's addictive to students, but they're actually making a real contribution to real research, and it completely brings to life the dry material in my text on how difficult it is to process digital data. And they report at the end of the semester they love this assignment. So I'm always looking for more assignments like this in my stats class and in all of my classes. But this one I would say is truly actively engaged. It's not adaptive. They don't get to pick what they're going to do. I'm still picking what they're doing and how much they're doing, but it's one of the most active exercises I have in my classes, and the students just love it. And at the end of the class, when I do my assessments, which are all essay-based, they're talking about imagery now in ways that students used to run from and not want to talk about. So it's been a very successful class activity for me. I would put this as a stage 4 active, even though the class as a whole is barely stage 3 deployed, but I'm very pleased with this activity.
Thank you for sharing, Rick. And I actually had similar experiences. I love this concept of citizen science because I think about active learning and the real world consequences it has. And so citizen science is one of those things that could start so early on. I'm thinking about like the frog watch programs where you can, as a child, you can go into your backyard and listen for frogs. And if you spot a frog, upload and share your observations, with National Geographic, that then informs a lab who's studying, patterns. Just the understanding that what you do could have an impact, not just on your classroom or on your grade, but on the world around you, and they're actually contributing to something meaningful, I think is part of that active learning experience, that you know it when you feel it. And not only do you know it when you see it or a part of it, you know it when you feel it, when you feel like you're making some sort of difference. Rick, thank you for crystallizing the concept of the maturity model by sharing some of your own examples. Thank you. I'm going to turn to other panelists and ask them to do the same. Anyone have any stories, examples?
Well, if I could jump in, I know one of the major criticisms that people have when they are trying to argue against active learning, at least at our institution, I hear a lot of faculty say, well, I just don't have time for that. I have this much content I have to cover. There's no way that I can have my students doing active learning. And so I try to give this example to those people who think that time is a major constraint for them. For example, I teach a botany class, and if you didn't know it, plants have hormones, and one of my units is the plant hormones. So students have to learn each of the hormones and what they do and how they work together and how that controls the development and function of plants. And so I could I could record a video, 50 minutes, actually it'd probably be more like 2 50-minute videos on the different plant hormones and everything they do. Or I could give a face-to-face lecture on that. It would take a couple class periods. But what I did instead is, or what I do now instead is I have my students do a jigsaw exercise, it's called, where I assign each team, they have to go out and research one of the plant hormones. And so they do it as individuals, and then they come together and they put all their research together and they create a document that is all the research of that hormone, and then they present and they share what they learned to their classmates. And so it takes the same amount of class time in that, or the same amount of hours online, and I teach it both face-to-face and online. And so it really isn't any more of our precious learning time, but the students are actively engaged, and then they have arguments about which hormone's the most important and which one does the coolest things. And so they're much more involved in what they're learning because they're teaching it and they're responsible for the learning of their classmates. And so that's one example. And if I had to put it on a maturity model, I might put it as a step 2 or 3, maybe. It's still just basically learning the content, but they find it more dynamic.
Thank you for sharing that example. And also for all of us being willing to admit that we're not 5s yet, right? And I think that's more than okay. It's really hard to get to transformation.
Yeah, I'll throw out there that the glass model that I described earlier in the session, that's probably a stage 3. And one thing that I wanted to point out was, I think it was nuanced in Rick's description, that this model gives us common language to talk about the maturity of a specific activity in your course, or the maturity level of your course, or there was some discussion in the chat that you can extend that to the program level too if you start looking at larger trends. So I think we can apply that model at various levels of scale.
Thank you, Wendy. I'll pause and ask Julie. It's been a little while since we've heard from you. I'd love to hear, as you're kind of taking this all in and getting different perspectives that ultimately impact the student experience. What do you think? What do you think of all this? What are your words of wisdom to offer us?
I definitely think, like, as of right now, a lot of my classes have reading assignments, and then they have like publisher assignments that have already been like set up, or they've been set up through the publisher. And I feel like it's just a lot of busy work, because you're just trying to like just get the answers, and more so a lot of the time you're just trying to get it done instead of like really understanding the material or really understanding what's going on. And so I think like we need to somehow get away from that. And I feel like it's definitely hard to do that. And I know a lot of people have issues with time being an excuse of some way, shape, or form. But I just think there are so many different activities that we could do, or assignments we could do within the classroom or outside of the classroom, that could improve on things. I know games, I love learning through games. I think that is like one of the best things ever, because it's just so active. Like you're actively sitting there, you're trying to figure out either what your next move is in whatever you're doing, versus just sitting through a lecture.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head, and actually brought up some earlier points that I want to kind of tie all together, and that's understanding the unique value proposition. If the unique value proposition or the why, as Joan pointed out earlier, is not articulated, it's going to feel like busy work, even if it's not intended in any way, shape, or form to be busy work. So clearly, like, that represents maybe a missing link, between instructor and student. What are we communicating about the why and the purpose and the desired outcomes, of such assignments? So, no, thank you so much for sharing, Julie. I appreciate it. Nicole, any insights?
Something that I said in the chat earlier, just kind of as everyone's been talking, it definitely feels like this is something that students and faculty can do together. It's not like, oh, it's up to the faculty to do active learning, or it's up to the students to do active learning. It's that feedback together of students saying, okay, this isn't working for me, I need this to change. And the faculty member going, okay, let me fix this. And the faculty member providing that information to the student saying, okay, I've given you what you want, now let's start learning. It's a process that we do together and can really help each other.
It is a team sport for sure. Thank you, Nicole. Well, I'll kick it over to our audience now. We've heard some examples from panelists. You've had a chance to chew on a little bit of the maturity model and see and kind of see it come to life with some of these examples. Before we drop the link in and invite you to go into the Google Doc version and start, making all your edits and your comments, I would just invite you to share maybe some of your own examples and how you would kind of, where you'd stack them up in the model. Or in lieu of giving an example, if you have any kind of feedback in the moment that you'd like to give, or observations about the model or anything that's been said, you're more than welcome to.
Well, I think one of the things that occurred to me is we were looking at the model and thinking about this in terms of assignments that we're giving students in particular. And I know that you made a good point about it being applied at many levels, so programmatic courses, assignments. But, you know, particularly with assignments, I think that one of the things that as we're tagging different things and we're doing curriculum development, I think that would actually help, like if you have an assignment is at a level 1, and then being able to identify that and say, hey, what about moving it to a level 2 or a level 3, and really encouraging people that way. And so from a design perspective, I'm kind of excited about the maturity model as kind of a way of describing levels, I guess, of assignments.
Yeah, and where to go from there. And it's like identify.
That resonates with me in a particular way that I hadn't really thought of, because we talk a lot about maintaining the right level of scaffolding when we're teaching.
Mm-hmm.
It could be that as we think about this more and more and more, we might come to realize that a scaffolding assignment has to be at a lower stage than the assignment at scaffolding.
Mm-hmm.
There's a place for sometimes straight lecture. There's a place for simple discussion. There's a place for things that would rate fairly low on this maturity scale, which is low has to not be seen as bad, because maybe scaffolding needs to be at a lower level of digitization, perhaps, or lower level of innovation than the assignments at scaffolding. Sometimes you just have to sit and explain something to somebody. You have to show them something before you send them off into the active world, perhaps. So maybe just the level plateaus eventually might need to be rethought, to the extent that there might be a foundation that needs to be. Maybe there's a reason why so much of what we do, even in a successful course, is at the stage 3 deployed. Because you need a certain amount of scaffolding to hold up the things we're doing at stage 4 and stage 5. I don't know. We'll have to think about that in the future.
And as you are witnessing, this is very much a draft. As you know, as Rick just hinted, we're looking for this type of feedback. Maybe it's not steps, maybe it's a circle, maybe it's concentric circles, I don't know. But we're looking exactly for that type of input, because what we'd like to do is, when you're having those tough conversations that sometimes it's hard to put words to or even map to be able to say, okay, how do we take this from a 1 to a 2 or a 2 to a 3, and even, you know, be a little bit more aspirational. So in the Google draft that we'll be sharing a link to in the chat shortly, there's a little bit more detail than what you saw on just the, you know, the beautiful draft steps. And so we'd like your thinking around, you know, what each of these stages even means, and, you know, even some examples in there as well. So we've got about 10 minutes left here, 12 minutes left. We've had a pretty robust conversation here today. I'm so appreciative of all the comments from the audience, and I don't necessarily even have questions to articulate from the audience, because every time someone has asked something, someone has gone back in and answered it. So I'm so appreciative of how everyone has jumped in. So now I'm going to kind of go around and kick it over to each of the panelists for each of you to give a final word. Certainly, we all entered this conversation today and in kind of one frame of mind with our own thinking, and we're leaving it with different viewpoints that are composites of each other's, which I love. We're building on it. So I'd love each of the panelists to kind of jump in with your last word, your closing remark for the day. And Masha, we'll start with you first.
So my closing remark would be, I really highly wanted to recommend a piece, an easy read by Darby and Lang from 2019. It's called Small Teaching Online. The reason why I love that is because we all get excited about making these changes, and we want to redesign our courses, we want to implement all of this, but let's be honest, we are all so overwhelmed and so busy from teaching, you know, either a class of 2,000 students or teaching 2,000 classes, that waiting for the time when we're going to redesign everything pretty much never happens. So why I really like this is because they affirm that taking baby steps is okay. And even though we think that by redesigning one assignment or redesigning one activity, we don't make any change, we in fact do make a change, and research supports that. I started doing that in my classes, and over the course of 3 or 4 semesters, I redesign one module each semester or one major assignment each semester, from students writing a paper to students doing a portfolio. And I noticed, I did a study on this, I'm just about to submit, I found statistically significant differences in students' perception of their learning for each learning outcome, just by redesigning an assessment, which, doing one assessment every semester did not take a lot of time for me. And if I were waiting to redesign a whole class, then that would never happen, probably. So I enjoy this reading because it says that any change, even though it seems very small, can have a great impact on student learning. And this incremental approach actually helps us make small but effective changes that we cannot make if we wait for this perfect timing to come.
Thank you so much for sharing. And that resource is Small Teaching Online by
Correct.
Dalby and Lang.
Correct.
Thank you so much. Francisca, your thoughts?
Okay, so from my perspective, I think I go back to what Rick and some of the conversations earlier, he indicated how stage 4 is so difficult to achieve. And the one word that he used at the time was involved rather than flipped. And so I'm kind of going back and forth between, well, involved, does it mean deeply? Is there a qualifier in there as well? How much involvement should you have? And so I'm going to do a shameless plug because I will be doing the same. Let's, participants today and panelists, let's see how we can flesh out with actual examples in this draft model, so that technologies like myself and all of you can start thinking of tools that could enhance or provide what we all need as learners, in learning, achieving learning, I should say. So that would be my parting words, if you will. Let's get deeply involved and engaged.
I love it. I feel like that's more of a call to action and less of a plug.
Yes.
So I'm on board.
Oh, okay. Let's do it.
Yeah, let's do it. Dana.
I would just like to encourage both the faculty and the students in the audience to try and lead some of this effort at your institution. Everybody can lead a little something. They can move something in their class. They can show it to other faculty members. They can push their administration to provide more resources for facilitating this and other faculty members. So there's just a lot of things you can do regardless of whatever level you're at, and to move this forward.
Thank you so much. Your thoughts, Wendy?
I would just encourage everybody to try new things, keep trying new things, even if it doesn't go well the first time. In fact, it's highly likely that it won't go perfectly the first time. There's a lot of literature that says when you implement something new, it takes 3 iterations of teaching your course before it's really solid and perfected. So change is hard, and you may get critical feedback from students, but don't let that stop you. Just use that as feedback on how might I tweak this and make it a little bit better next time, rather than saying, see, it didn't work, throw it out the window. So just keep trying new things, fail your way forward.
Fail your way forward. I love that. I've heard so many different versions of celebrating failure, but not fail your way forward. I'm going to use that. Thank you. I needed that. Bethany, your thoughts?
Sure. So I guess as a kind of a mid-career faculty member that's been doing this for a while, I really am excited about this model because it inspires me to keep innovating. So I think we all have experienced when you teach a class the same way for a certain period of time, you need to rethink it, maybe just for yourself, not only for the students, and not only because the content itself is changing as your discipline grows, but even just to stimulate yourself. And so I think this model kind of gives me a strategy by which to say, okay, so I have this activity. it would probably be better as if it were a step higher. What do I need to do to make that step? So.
I was on mute, so you couldn't hear me thanking you. Thank you so much, Bethany. Julie, your final thoughts.
One thing I want to mention is we all need to think about how we learn, because there's so many different types of learning. If you might design an assignment for readers, perhaps you maybe design not the same, but you might design another assignment with a similar outcome that you're trying to achieve for somebody who's maybe a visual learner or an auditory learner.
There's definitely, multiple modalities. Great point. Engaging with students where they are and, what they like doing and what their preferences are. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there, Julie.
You're fine. I didn't have anything more to say.
Oh, perfect. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective today. And how about you, Nicole?
I mostly just want to say thank you to everyone here, because we've had such great discussion in the chat. I feel like, I know I've been part of some webinars where the chat's been mostly quiet, but I feel like we've all been able to feed off of each other and help foster different ideas. So I'm really excited to see how our model grows from here, especially since we're all from different institutions across the country, all different backgrounds and disciplines. So I'm excited to see what different ideas we can come up with and put in this model.
That's a great point. And there's a very specific reason to use Shaping EDU as a platform for doing this kind of work, because it's one thing to come up with a model, in a room with people from your own institution, maybe in your own, a similar role to you. But for something to truly be pervasive and effective for the masses or for more people, we need to engage all kinds of stakeholders at the very, very, very beginning, and all the way from the discussion phase through iteration and adapting. So thank you all for surfacing these perspectives. Rick, final thoughts from you before we close things out.
Well, I wanted to Wendy, echo Wendy's thoughts on failing it forward. That reminds me of, in terms of active learning, if we want our students to jump in and learn actively, we have to be very tolerant of mistakes. We have to be very tolerant of error. And yet so often as instructors, we try not to make any. So one of the rules I follow for myself when I'm doing, say, my statistics class lectures, which is a live class half the time, I make a point of always doing lectures based on choosing exercises I can do in front of them that I actively avoid looking at before class. So when I'm doing an exercise in front of the class, I make a lot of mistakes, be they statistical mistakes or calculation mistakes or just dumb things in Excel, but I want my students to see that. I know it's working well if they start laughing at some of my mistakes, because they need to see the kinds of mistakes you routinely make when you do statistics in this case, and how you recover from those. If every time you teach something, maybe record a video for class, you edit out all the mistakes so it's a shorter video. But if the video doesn't include you making any mistakes, you create an expectation that this can be done without making any mistakes. And then when they try to do it, they can't seem to do it without making mistakes, and they're afraid to share and they're afraid to open up. So I think our willingness as instructors to be more student-like in front of our own students is very, very important. That if in an active environment we expect them to experiment and make mistakes, but we never demonstrate a willingness to make a mistake in front of them, we're going to kind of fall short on getting the kind of engagement we're looking for from class. And then just one more thought on the metacognitive side. I've worked in many organizations that were bound by or governed by some kind of capability maturity model over the years in my career. There's lots of them in engineering. So typically they're taught to me in a training session, in a lecture. I have to read them. I'm tested on them, then we're audited. There's no active learning, there's no engagement. You just follow the rules because you have to. This is the first time I've been involved in the creation of one of these models in a more active process. And it's really made the concept more alive for me. So I can honestly say that in this process, I have been a more active learner on the student side. And I see the benefits of doing that. If this was the way I was taught some of the engineering models that I've been forced to work under over the years, I think I would understand them better and I would have found it easier to use them. But this is the first time I've been able to actively engage, not just in learning the model, but in helping to create it. I think that's a big plus that we can demonstrate for people. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. I think driving home the importance of leading by example, with students, but also the importance of communities of practice and our active learning that takes place in those communities as lifelong learners. So lots to chew on here. But what comes next? So I want to thank the panelists. I want to thank you all so much for sharing your time and your insights, not just today, but all of our rehearsals and discussions leading up to this point. Thank you, thank you. And of course, to our audience who is so willing to jump in, share your viewpoints, ask hard questions, and really engage with us. You really helped bring the conversation alive, so thank you. So next up, we want to keep continuing these conversations. We realize that this is just kind of part of a journey and we have a long way to go. So please jump into our Slack workspace to continue the conversation in the Constellations channel. Everyone who is not currently in the Shaping EDU Slack workspace, just by virtue of registering for this session, you'll have received an invitation to join the Slack workspace. If you have lost your invitation, you can't find it, you need help, just let me know. Next, we took the maturity model and put it in a Google document to make it easy for you to not only add feedback, write in comments, things we may have missed, but then to also add your name at the end as a contributor. So when we go and publish the next version of this resource, that you could be included as a contributor. And then finally, we hope by attending this session, and we hope by virtue of you participating in tweaking the draft maturity model, that you will feel that sense of ownership and share and apply the finished model in your own work. So thank you so much. And until next time, keep dreaming, doing, and driving. Thank you.